I mean, think about it like this. If you break your arm, like an X-ray shows it immediately, right?
Right, it's undeniable. The doctor just points to that jagged white line on the screen.
Exactly. They tell you precisely what went wrong. The structural failure is totally visible and, universally understood.
Everyone agrees that your arm is broken. There's no debate.
Yeah, but what happens when the invisible architecture of your brain fails you, say, at age 40?
That's when society usually just calls you lazy.
Right, because
Mhm.
we expect medical diagnoses to be clean, binary. We want to see the fracture.
But when we step into the realm of neurodevelopment, that X-ray machine is entirely useless.
Completely useless. Especially when we're talking about how human attention and executive function operate under modern stress.
And that's exactly what we're getting into today.
Yeah, so welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are looking at a major medical pivot, one that suggests, the failure to cope with everyday adult life might not actually be a character flaw at all.
No, it might be a massive, undiagnosed medical blind spot.
So we're examining an excerpt from an article published by Mellos today.
Curated via Smart News, yeah.
Right. And it fundamentally challenges how society views attention deficits. But what really grounds this text is its source.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is that this was developed under the direct supervision of a medical doctor.
Which is huge.
It really is. It elevates the whole conversation. We aren't just looking at casual internet speculation or TikTok trends here.
No, this is a clinically recognized shift in how we understand neurological development across a whole human lifespan.
Not just childhood.
Exactly. And that's our mission for this deep dive. We're taking that clinical shift and examining the cascading implications for you, the listener.
Because it really does change everything.
It does. We're going to dismantle that incredibly stubborn myth that ADHD is strictly a childhood condition.
Which is such an outdated way of looking at it.
Totally. Then we'll explore the mechanics of why the breaking point for so many people occurs squarely in the middle of their lives.
Usually between their 30s and 50s,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and finally, we'll unpack this critical medical realization about gender. The symptoms present entirely differently depending on your gender and adult social conditioning.
That part is honestly mind-blowing.
It really is. So whether you are exploring your own cognitive patterns or maybe you manage a team of professionals at work.
Or you're just trying to understand why a really capable friend seems to be completely drowning in daily tasks.
Right. This analysis will completely reframe how you interpret the basic functions of adult life.
So, to start, the Mellos text opens by confronting this deeply entrenched societal bias.
The childhood myth.
Exactly. Historically, ADHD has been characterized almost exclusively as a pediatric issue.
I mean, the image most people hold is, what, a disruptive little boy running around a classroom?
Right, a child who can't sit still. But the article highlights a really significant recent surge in diagnoses categorized specifically as adult ADHD.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the skepticism surrounding this specific topic is intense.
Oh, absolutely. The pushback is very real.
Like, when we see a massive spike in adult diagnoses, the immediate cultural reaction is to assume it's just a trend.
A fad, yeah.
Because we live in this era where everyone is stressed, everyone is overworked, we're constantly distracted by smartphones.
The modern condition, basically.
Right. So how do we know this surge in adult ADHD isn't just, a byproduct of people self-diagnosing on social media because they're experiencing normal burnout?
That is the primary counterargument out there. And it's exactly why the medical supervision of this Mellos article is so vital.
Because it separates the trends from the biology.
Precisely. A clinical diagnosis of ADHD doesn't just measure stress or distraction. It measures a chronic, pervasive impairment in executive function.
And that has roots in actual neurological development.
Right. Burnout is a state of exhaustion caused by prolonged stress. But ADHD is an underlying structural difference in how the brain manages dopamine.
It's how the brain processes stimuli. It's built differently.
Exactly. So the surge in adult diagnoses doesn't represent some sudden biological epidemic.
Nor does a rigorous clinician just hand out a diagnosis because a patient says they're tired.
Right. What the surge actually represents is a societal awakening.
The medical community is finally adjusting its lens.
Yes. They're finally identifying individuals who have always had these neurological differences, but who managed to compensate for them.
Until they couldn't anymore. Until their environment just overwhelmed their capacity to adapt.
Exactly. That distinction between a temporary state of burnout and a lifelong structural difference is crucial.
So let's try to visualize this. Let's move away from the abstract and look at the actual mechanics of executive function.
I love this analogy.
Yeah, so think of an average neurotypical brain. It comes equipped with an automatic spam filter for environmental stimuli.
Right. It just works in the background.
Exactly. So if you're sitting in an open plan office, your brain automatically filters out, like, the hum of the air conditioner.
Or the conversation happening 3 desks away.
Right. Or the visual movement of cars outside the window. Your prefrontal cortex just naturally prioritizes the urgent email you're trying to write.
It tosses the rest into the spam folder so you don't even notice it.
Exactly. But in an ADHD brain,
The spam filter analogy perfectly illustrates the mechanism here. In an ADHD brain, the prefrontal cortex is basically understimulated.
and that's the part of the brain that acts as the conductor of the orchestra, right?
Yes. It manages working memory, impulse control, prioritization, but it lacks the optimal levels of neurotransmitters, like dopamine and norepinephrine.
Which are required to keep that automatic spam filter running.
Right. So without that automatic filter, the brain registers the hum of the air conditioner, the distant conversation, and that urgent email as having the exact same level of priority.
Oh, wow. Everything is urgent.
Everything is equally stimulating, so the individual has to manually, consciously expend immense cognitive energy just to suppress the irrelevant stuff.
Just to focus on the one task.
Yeah.
That explains the sheer exhaustion so many people report.
It's exhausting. You're manually doing the job of an automatic system all day.
Right, your cognitive bandwidth is going to be depleted before you even start doing actual work.
Every single day.
And in childhood, a failing spam filter might just result in, a student talking out of turn, or maybe forgetting a homework assignment.
Right, those are the visible glitches the educational system flags.
But as we move into adulthood, the consequences of that exact same neurological difference become severe.
The stakes get so much higher.
Yeah. I mean, missing a mortgage payment, forgetting to pick up a child from school, or failing to execute a multi-step project at work.
You can't just get a bad grade. You could lose your house or your job.
Right. So the individual is forced to build these elaborate, exhausting workarounds just to survive the day.
And those workarounds are known clinically as masking or compensatory strategies.
Give me some examples of what that looks like in daily life.
Well, an undiagnosed adult might rely on constant low-level anxiety to provide the adrenaline necessary to focus.
Wow. Using anxiety as an engine.
Exactly. They might set dozens of alarms, write identical to-do lists in multiple notebooks, or just rely on the sheer panic of a looming deadline.
To force their prefrontal cortex to finally engage.
Right. They are running incredibly heavy background applications just to keep their baseline functioning intact.
And the Mellows text pinpoints exactly when this fragile system tends to collapse.
It does. It zeroes right in on the 30 to 50 age bracket.
The 30 to 50 pressure cooker.
Yes.
Yes.
The article explicitly states that for many people, the struggles associated with ADHD first become visibly apparent and genuinely problematic during these middle decades.
And the text attributes this to the drastic increase in responsibilities at work and at home, right?
Yes, but let's dissect why this specific window of time is so catastrophic for someone relying on compensatory strategies.
Okay, let's do.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to introduce the concept of scaffolding.
Scaffolding, like in construction.
Exactly like that. In developmental psychology, scaffolding refers to the external structures, routines, and support systems that help an individual manage their life.
Okay, so consider the life cycle of a typical person. Through childhood and adolescence, life is heavily scaffolded by external forces.
Right. Parents dictate morning routines, meals, bedtimes.
Schools impose rigid schedules, clear deadlines, and immediate feedback.
The environment is essentially designed to manage executive function for the individual.
Even moving into early adulthood, like your 20s, that scaffolding often persists to some degree.
Yeah, a college syllabus provides a highly structured roadmap for a whole semester.
And an entry-level job typically involves a manager providing specific compartmentalized tasks. You get clear directives.
And your blast radius is small.
The blast radius.
Yeah, the number of people impacted if you fail to organize your time. In your 20s, it's generally limited to just yourself.
That makes so much sense. But then the critical inversion happens in your 30s and 40s.
Right. Not only is your external scaffolding gradually removed, but society suddenly expects you to become the scaffolding for others.
You become the load-bearing wall.
Exactly. You transition from the employee receiving tasks to the manager overseeing complex, long-term projects with no daily oversight.
And at home, you transition from a single adult managing one schedule to a parent managing a whole household.
A spouse's career logistics, children's medical appointments, school events.
Maybe even the care of aging parents.
The sheer volume of executive function required, the constant need to plan, prioritize, shift focus, regulate emotions, it just increases exponentially.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this brings up a profound question about the nature of this condition.
Go for it.
When someone hits this wall at age 40, are their underlying ADHD traits actually worsening? Or does the modern world just demand a level of executive function that breaks the camel's back?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right, because we're asking brains that evolved to hunt and gather, to process hundreds of emails, navigate suburban carpool logistics, track fluctuating mortgage rates, and manage corporate Slack channels simultaneously.
It's a lot.
So is the neurobiology failing? Or is the environment actively hostile to the way this specific brain functions?
Well, clinically speaking, the underlying neurobiology, the dopamine regulation, the prefrontal cortex structure, it remains relatively static.
So the ADHD itself doesn't get worse with age.
The traits do not inherently worsen, no. However, a psychiatric diagnosis requires the presence of an impairment.
Oh, okay.
If you have the traits of ADHD, but your environment provides enough scaffolding that you function well, you may never meet the clinical threshold for a diagnosis.
Because you aren't impaired yet.
Exactly. The impairment manifests when the environmental load exceeds your cognitive capacity to compensate.
So when an individual's coping mechanisms shatter in their 40s, it's not because their brain suddenly changed.
No. It's because the load they're carrying finally crushed the fragile workarounds they spent decades building.
Oh, man. The psychological toll of that collapse must be absolutely devastating.
It truly is.
Because when an adult suddenly finds themselves dropping balls they used to juggle with ease, their internal narrative rarely jumps to, oh, my external scaffolding has collapsed, revealing an underlying neurodevelopmental difference.
No one thinks that. They default to intense self-blame.
They assume they're losing their edge, that they lack discipline, or that they're just getting lazy or incompetent.
The shame is immense, and it's reinforced by that persistent cultural myth we discussed earlier.
Because society still views it as a childhood behavioral issue.
Right. So the struggling adult feels they have no valid framework to understand their own failure.
Which is why the medical consensus outlined in the Mellis article is so vital. It offers a total paradigm shift.
It replaces moral judgment with medical understanding.
It reframes that midlife collapse, not as a sudden lack of willpower, but as the totally predictable intersection between a neurodivergent brain and peak societal demands.
Exactly. And that brings us to the third major revelation in the source material, which introduces a completely different layer of complexity.
Gender.
Gender, yes.
The text points out that we now recognize clear gender differences in how ADHD symptoms manifest.
This is huge.
Yeah, the specific excerpt we're analyzing actually focuses on characteristics common in adult ADHD men, which structurally implies that there is a distinctly separate presentation for adult women.
And this is perhaps the most significant diagnostic correction occurring in psychiatry today.
Because of how the original criteria were modeled.
Exactly. As we established, the original diagnostic criteria were modeled almost entirely on how the condition presented in hyperactive, externally disruptive children.
Predominantly young boys.
Yes. If you fit that specific behavioral template, you were identified. But neurodevelopmental conditions do not manifest uniformly across the board.
And the medical community, represented by the doctor supervising this article, is finally acknowledging the profound impact of socialization on symptom presentation. Let's break down that socialization mechanism, because if society conditions different genders to handle distress and impulse control differently,
then the visible symptoms of the exact same underlying neurological condition will diverge wildly.
Right. Broadly speaking, traditional socialization often allows or even expects young boys to externalize their struggles.
Hyperactivity is expressed physically, running, climbing, interrupting the teacher.
Right. But conversely, traditional socialization for young girls heavily emphasizes compliance, quietness, emotional containment.
So a young girl with the exact same dopamine deficit and understimulated prefrontal cortex as her male counterpart will often internalize the hyperactivity.
Instead of bouncing off the walls of the classroom, her mind is bouncing off the walls of her skull.
That's a great way to put it. She might sit perfectly still, appearing completely compliant,
While her internal monologue races at 1,000 miles an hour, totally disconnected from the lesson.
but because she isn't disrupting the system doesn't flag her for an evaluation.
She just slips right through the cracks.
And she often develops severe anxiety or depression as secondary conditions because she's constantly trying to mask that internal
That's
chaos.
to appear normal. And then fast forward 20 years, and she enters that 30 to 50 pressure cooker we just mapped out.
She is drowning in the executive dysfunction required to manage a career and a household.
But because she presents with paralyzing anxiety and internal overwhelm rather than physical hyperactivity.
The traditional diagnostic radar misses her completely. She gets treated for mood disorders, while the root neurological cause is completely ignored.
How many people are walking around right now thinking their struggles are just character flaws because their symptoms don't match the textbook definition?
Millions, probably. And the Mellows article's focus on adult men is equally fascinating here.
Right, because it highlights that even the classic externalizing presentation changes over time.
Because an adult man who was physically hyperactive as a child doesn't typically run laps around a corporate boardroom at age 40.
That would certainly get him noticed.
It would, but instead, the physical restlessness morphs into something else.
It translates into internal restlessness
Yeah.
and behavioral impulsivity.
Yes. The article's focus on adult men highlights how the brain's search for dopamine manifests in an adult environment.
Like changing careers impulsively every year because they can't tolerate the understimulation of routine.
Exactly. Or engaging in high-risk hobbies, struggling with substance regulation.
Or emotional dysregulation.
Yeah.
Like sudden intense bursts of frustration when a project stalls at work.
The core mechanism, a brain-seeking regulation, remains exactly the same. But the outward behavior adapts.
This entirely recontextualizes behaviors that we typically judge as just, personality flaws in the workplace.
It really does.
Like the employee who chronically interrupts in meetings might not be arrogant. They might literally lack the neurological brake pedal required to hold a thought in working memory without speaking it aloud.
Or the partner who constantly seeks out conflict at home might be subconsciously generating adrenaline just to wake up their understimulated prefrontal cortex.
Wow. I mean, recognizing these mechanisms doesn't excuse harmful behavior, obviously.
No, not at all. But it completely changes the approach to managing it.
Right. It shifts the approach from punitive to structural.
That is the key right there.
So, if you understand that a lack of executive function is causing an employee to miss deadlines, putting them on a disciplinary track that demands more self-organization,
Will only accelerate their failure. You're asking a broken leg to run a marathon.
right? The intervention must involve rebuilding scaffolding.
Yes. Implementing clearer step-by-step check-ins. Utilizing external project management tools to offload working memory.
Adjusting the environmental stimuli so they aren't manually filtering spam all day.
Exactly. Understanding these nuances, the age of onset of struggles, the trigger of responsibility, the gender differences, is exactly why doctor-supervised targeted information like this is so vital.
It serves to educate both the individual and the surrounding systems on how to recognize these divergent profiles.
And how to actually support them long-term.
Okay, so we have extracted a tremendous amount of insight from a very specific piece of source material today.
We really covered a lot of ground.
So what does this all mean? Let's synthesize our findings.
Well, fundamentally, the understanding of human attention is shifting. ADHD is finally shedding its outdated reputation as a temporary pediatric behavioral issue.
Right. It is a lifelong structural difference in the brain's operating system.
And for many, this difference remains adequately masked by intelligence and environmental scaffolding.
Until the massive compounding responsibilities of midlife shatter those coping mechanisms.
Exactly. Furthermore, the medical community now recognizes that identifying this condition requires a nuanced approach.
One that accounts for how socialization and gender dictate the presentation of symptoms.
Because the ultimate value of this deep dive lies in application.
Right. When we understand the mechanics of cognitive load and the loss of scaffolding, we cultivate a much more accurate, productive form of empathy.
Empathy that actually leads to solutions.
Exactly. So I want to direct this right back to you, the listener. Think about the environments you navigate daily.
At work, at home, everywhere.
If you observe a colleague, a family member, or even yourself suddenly failing to manage tasks that previously seemed totally manageable,
Or if someone is expressing deep frustration over a perceived lack of discipline.
reconsider the lens you're looking through. When someone is struggling to keep their head above water in their 30s or 40s, asking, "Why aren't you trying harder?" is almost always the wrong question.
It's the least helpful thing you could ask.
The far more illuminating question is, what invisible scaffolding just collapsed?
Because identifying that missing structure is the first step toward building a sustainable environment.
Rather than demanding an individual somehow outwork their own neurology, which we know is impossible.
It just leads to more burnout.
Right. Now, as we close out this analysis, I want to leave you with a final thought to examine on your own. Building on the realities of the modern pressure cooker we just discussed,
Oh, this is a good one.
we have established that the human brain relies on executive function to filter stimuli and manage complex long-term planning, right?
Right.
We have also established that modern society demands a volume of executive function that is historically unprecedented.
The cognitive load of the 21st century is just staggering.
Precisely. So if the symptoms of adult ADHD become most visible and destructive, precisely when occupational and domestic responsibilities reach their absolute peak.
We have to ask a difficult question about the line between pathology and environment.
Yes. To what extent are we accurately identifying a specific medical condition? And to what extent are we simply witnessing a completely natural biological failure to cope with the impossible, unrelenting demands of modern adulthood?
Are our brains actually failing?
Or is the world we have constructed simply too heavy for the human mind to carry?
It's a question that requires us to look not just at our own neurobiology, but at the sustainability of the society we've built.
Exactly. Something to really mull over. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.